He built America's financial system from scratch, yet died broke. Alexander Hamilton was one of the most brilliant minds of the founding era, but his life ended in a bloody duel over pride and politics. Long before the wars, the politics, and the power, there was an island, quiet, humid, swept by salt and wind. Nevis in the British West Indies sat small and almost invisible on the map of the world. But in the mid-18th century, that's where one of history's sharpest minds was born. Alexander Hamilton, or maybe not. You see, even his birth is a riddle. Some records say he was born in 1755. Others insist it was 1757. Alexander himself sometimes seemed unsure. Or perhaps he wanted to forget. What we do know is that he was born into nothing. His mother, Rachel Fossé, was of French Huguenot descent. She had once been married to a Danish merchant, but that relationship crumbled. Her divorce wasn't recognized by the church. So when she began a relationship with James Hamilton, Alexander's father, it was considered scandalous. They were never legally married, which made young Alexander illegitimate. That word carried weight back then, heavy weight. It meant doors closed before you could knock. It meant whispers in the street. It meant shame you didn't earn but had to carry. Alexander grew up surrounded by economic hardship. His father struggled to find steady work. His mother, although resourceful and determined, couldn't shield him from poverty. The family moved from Nevis to Squaw trying to build a life. But bad luck followed them like a shadow. When Alexander was around 11, James Hamilton abandoned the family, likely ashamed and unable to provide. 2 years later, Rachel died of a fever, likely yellow fever, leaving Alexander and his older brother orphans. Just like that, everything was gone. Alexander was barely a teenager. He had new father, new mother, new inheritance, new title. But he had two things that would carry him further than any noble name could: his mind and his pen. And while the world saw just another colonial orphan, small, skinny, and forgettable, Alexander Hamilton was already quietly preparing to prove them all wrong. Because sometimes, the people with the least end up doing the most. After his mother's death, young Alexander Hamilton was left with little more than her name and the burden of survival. He and his brother were taken in by a cousin, Peter Lytton, but that refuge didn't last. Within a year, Linton died by suicide. Alexander was once again homeless. Not yet 14. He had no stable shelter, no family to lean on, and no education beyond the basics his mother had managed to give him. He found work as a clerk at an import-export firm run by a merchant named Beekman and Kruger on the island of St. Ca. It wasn't glamorous. He handled invoices, tracked cargo, calculated currency exchanges, and kept ledgers. But for a boy with a hungry mind, it was a school in itself. Day by day, Alexander absorbed the rhythms of commerce, learning how the world really worked. Not in textbooks, but in ships, and sugar, and debt. He was trusted, efficient, and sharp. By the time he was 15, he was left in charge of the entire business when the owner was away. Think about that. Most teenagers couldn't be trusted to sweep a floor properly. Alexander was managing trade routes, but the Sierra wasn't filled with opportunity. It was thick with slavery, economic despair, and colonial hierarchy. Alexander saw it all up close, and he hated it. He started writing. His letters were thoughtful, observant, sometimes poetic. They weren't just teenage ramblings. They had power, structure, and vision. He'd write about hurricanes as if describing a god's fury. He'd discuss politics, faith, morality. Then came the storm. In 1772, a hurricane tore through Squaw. It ravaged buildings, sank ships, and left the island gasping. In the aftermath, Hamilton wrote a detailed account of the disaster for the local newspaper. But it wasn't just a news report. It was art. A 15-year-old boy described wind and water with the grace of a novelist and the placed insight of a philosopher. Local leaders read the piece and were stunned. Who was this boy? How did he write like that? They passed around his essay. They started whispering. Then they started collecting donations. The people of Sanqua, impoverished and rebuilding, gathered enough money to send this orphan boy to America, because even in darkness, genius glows. In the fall of 1772, Alexander Hamilton left the Caribbean behind. He boarded a ship bound for the American colonies, clutching the hopes of the people who believed in him and the burden of becoming someone who mattered. He was just a teenager, barely 16, possibly younger, but he already carried himself like a man racing time. When he arrived in Boston and later made his way to New York, the world looked completely different. Crowded streets, churches, dockyards, colleges. This wasn't St. Croix. This was chaos, opportunity, fire. He enrolled at King's College, what we now know as Columbia University. It was one of the finest schools in the colonies, and Hamilton wasted no time. He devoured books like a starving man. He studied law, philosophy, economics, political theory, anything and everything. But learning wasn't enough. Not for him. He wanted to speak. He wanted to write. And more than anything, he wanted to shape the world around him. The colonies, meanwhile, were teetering on the edge of revolution. Tensions with Britain had reached a boiling point. Taxes, soldiers, tyranny. The streets pulsed with the electricity of rebellion, and Hamilton stepped right into it. He started writing political essays under pseudonyms, defending the colonist right to resist British rule. Readers thought the author must be a seasoned scholar or a high-ranking official. When they found out it was a teenager, they couldn't believe it. Soon, Hamilton began giving speeches in public squares. Fiery, bold, overflowing with ideas. He wasn't just echoing popular slogans. He was thinking ahead, imagining a new kind of government, a new kind of future, and people noticed. New York was full of revolutionaries, but Hamilton stood out. He wasn't from the elite families. He had no pedigree, but he had something better, vision and the fearless conviction to share it. He drilled with a militia in his free time, trained for war while he studied law, and wrote with the weight of a man twice his age. To some, he was brilliant, to others, arrogant, but no one could ignore him. America had just met Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton had just found his battlefield. By the early 1770s, the colonies weren't just complaining anymore. They were preparing to fight. The British Crown had tightened its grip with taxes, troops, and proclamations. And while some men hesitated, others stood up. Alexander Hamilton was one of them. Still a student at King's College, Hamilton couldn't sit still. He joined a New York volunteer militia called the Hearts of Oak. They were young, mostly students, and woefully inexperienced. But what they lacked in training, they made up for in passion. Each morning before sunrise, Hamilton drilled with his comrades in a graveyard beside Trinity Church. They trained with borrowed weapons, learned the basics of formation, and studied British military tactics. At night, he buried himself in books, classics, strategy, economics, philosophy. Day and night, mind and body, Hamilton was preparing for something big. In 1775, when war officially broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord, Hamilton was ready. He helped lead a daring raid on a British battery in Manhattan, stealing cannons under enemy fire. It was bold, dangerous, and successful. Exactly the kind of act that caught attention. Hamilton's leadership was unmistakable. He wasn't just a writer anymore. He was now a soldier, and a good one. Within months, he earned a commission as captain of an artillery company. It was a rare position for someone so young and without connections, but Hamilton had proved himself in both word and action. His company saw action in several key battles, including the Battle of Princeton, where Hamilton's guns helped secure a pivotal victory for the Continental Army. His skill didn't go unnoticed. Commanders praised his discipline and organization. His troops respected him, and news of a brilliant young artillery captain with a silver tongue and steel nerves began to spread. But someone else had noticed, too. Someone who would change Hamilton's life forever. General George Washington. Washington, commander of the Continental Army, was constantly on the lookout for men who could think, lead, and act under pressure. And in Alexander Hamilton, he found all three. Hamilton had no way of knowing, but his days as a frontline officer were numbered. He was about to be called somewhere even more powerful than the battlefield. He was about to step inside the war room of a revolution. In 1777, something unexpected happened. Alexander Hamilton, barely in his 20s, commanding an artillery unit with growing respect, received an invitation. General George Washington wanted him not as a field commander, but as part of his inner military staff. At first glance, it might have seemed like a step backward. Hamilton loved the battlefield. He thrived on action, movement, and strategy under fire, but this was different. This was Washington, and this offer wasn't a demotion. It was a doorway into the very heart of the revolution. Hamilton accepted. Washington made him an aide-de-camp, a kind of chief of staff, but in truth, he was far more than a glorified secretary. He became Washington's most trusted advisor, writing letters, orders, and diplomatic messages, many in Washington's voice. Hamilton's pen never stopped moving. His words carried authority, clarity, and purpose. He corresponded with generals, governors, and Congress. When orders needed to be obeyed, Hamilton's letters made. Why do we need a stronger government? How will checks and balances protect freedom? Why should people trust a national judiciary? Hamilton poured his soul into these arguments. He wasn't just defending a document. He was defending the very future of the Republic. And it worked. Slowly, state by state, the Constitution was ratified. In 1789, it officially became the supreme law of the land. The United States now had a government, and Alexander Hamilton, he wasn't just one of its architects. He was about to become its chief engineer. In 1789, the new American government took its first breath. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. And when it came time to fill his cabinet with the sharpest minds in the country, he knew exactly who he wanted to manage the nation's finances: Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was sworn in as the first Secretary of the Treasury, a title that might have sounded bureaucratic, but in reality came with a staggering challenge. The United States was broke. There was no national currency, no central banking system, no public credit. The government owed millions in war debts to foreign allies, private citizens, and even its own soldiers. The economy was fractured, unstable, and teetering on collapse. To most it seemed like a disaster. To Hamilton it was an opportunity. He got to work immediately drafting reports, crunching numbers, and designing a financial system from scratch. His goal not just to solve the present crisis, but to lay the foundation for a strong modern economy. His first move was bold. The federal government would assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. This meant the national government would now owe money, not the individual states. Many saw this as dangerous. Hamilton saw it as brilliant. Why? Because if the federal government owed money, lenders, especially the wealthy elite, would have a vested interest in its survival. Next, he proposed the creation of a national bank, a central institution that could manage government funds, issue stable currency, and stimulate economic growth. He also introduced tariffs and taxes designed to protect American manufacturing and help generate revenue. To Hamilton, economics wasn't just about math. It was about power. He believed that a strong economy would lead to a strong nation, and that public credit, once restored, would attract investment, create jobs, and elevate the United States on the global stage. But not everyone shared his vision. His policies triggered fierce opposition, especially from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who feared that Hamilton was creating an elite centralized government too similar to Britain's monarchy. Still, Washington backed him, and slowly but surely Hamilton's ideas took root. The U.S. economy began to stabilize. Confidence grew. The dollar gained value. In just a few years, Hamilton had taken a bankrupt, fractured collection of states and given it the beating heart of a functioning economy. He wasn't just managing money. he was building a nation. As Alexander Hamilton's financial system began to take shape, so did his reputation, not just as a brilliant architect of the economy, but as a polarizing force in American politics. To his supporters, Hamilton was a genius, a man who turned chaos into order and gave the young nation a real future. But to his critics, he was dangerous, too bold, too centralized, too British in style with his talk of national banks, strong executives, and urban industry. And no critic was louder or more persistent than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, the Secretary of State, was Hamilton's opposite in nearly every way. Where Hamilton believed in cities, commerce, and concentrated federal power, Jefferson believed in rural life, individual liberty, and limited government. He saw America as a land of farmers and freedom, not financiers and federal banks. The two men couldn't have disagreed more. To Jefferson, Hamilton's national bank was unconstitutional. His debt plan was a favor to the wealthy, his tariffs and taxes a burden on the common man. He believed Hamilton was steering the country toward a dangerous aristocracy where elites ruled and liberty suffered. To Hamilton, Jefferson was naive. His vision of an agrarian paradise ignored economic reality. Without credit, without industry, without structure, Hamilton believed the nation would crumble. The clash was more than philosophical. It became personal. Each man had allies. Jefferson had Madison, and Hamilton had Washington's ear. Their disagreements turned the cabinet into a war zone. Washington, though respectful of Jefferson, often sided with Hamilton. He valued results, and Hamilton delivered them. Still, the feud grew. In the press, Jefferson's allies accused Hamilton of corruption and tyranny. In return, Hamilton's supporters painted Jefferson as weak and idealistic. What began as debate quickly hardened into rivalry and eventually birthed something new in American history: political parties. Hamilton's followers became known as the Federalists, Jeffersons, the Democratic-Republicans. The country, still young and fragile, was now splitting into factions. It wasn't what the Founding Fathers had wanted, but it was what the moment demanded. And right in the center of it all stood Alexander Hamilton. Praised, hated, unstoppable. He had built an economy. Now, unknowingly, he had helped build the machinery of American politics. The United States had barely found its footing before it began to divide, not by geography, but by ideology. And at the heart of this division stood two powerful opposing minds: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton never intended to start a political party, but his policies, national debt consolidation, a central bank, manufacturing support, and a strong executive were radical enough to make him a symbol of a broader political movement. His followers, urban merchants, financiers, lawyers, and many war veterans rallied around his ideas. They called themselves Federalists. On the other side, Jefferson and James Madison spoke to farmers, artisans, and states' rights advocates. They feared that Hamilton's version of government would turn the republic into an oligarchy ruled by banks and elites. They formed what would become the Democratic-Republican Party. This was the birth of America's first party system. The press, which had once focused on foreign affairs and commerce, now became weaponized. Partisan newspapers sprang up like wildfire. Hamilton's allies wrote fiery editorials defending central authority and financial discipline. Jefferson's camp countered with blistering critiques, accusing Hamilton of betraying the Revolution by building a system that benefited the rich. Hamilton, ever combative, gave as good as he got. He wrote under pseudonyms, leaked damaging letters, and used his incredible skill with language to shape public opinion. He wasn't just managing policy, he was managing narratives. Washington, who deeply disliked factionalism, grew increasingly uncomfortable. He had hoped that his presidency would set a tone of unity, but by the end of his second term, the cabinet was a political battlefield and the nation a house divided. Eventually, Jefferson resigned from Washington's cabinet, disgusted by Hamilton's influence. But even in resignation, his movement grew stronger, and then came the election of 1796, America's first real contested presidential race. John Adams, a Federalist, won, but Jefferson, his opponent, became vice president under the rules of the time. It was an awkward, tense administration, and Hamilton, although no longer in the cabinet, still pulled strings from behind the curtain. The Revolution had created a nation, but Hamilton and Jefferson had created something longer lasting, the template for American political conflict. Ideas versus power, cities versus farms, central versus local, and the fight was far from over. Alexander Hamilton had built a reputation as a man of brilliance, order, and discipline. But in 1797, that image would shatter. It all began several years earlier during the summer of 1791. Hamilton, then the Secretary of the Treasury and one of the most powerful men in the country, was approached at home by a young woman named Maria Reynolds. She claimed her husband had abandoned her and asked Hamilton for financial help. He agreed. But what followed wasn't charity. It was an affair. Hamilton and Maria Reynolds began a secret relationship that lasted for months. But it wasn't just an affair. It turned into a trap. Her husband, James Reynolds, found out and blackmailed Hamilton, demanding money to keep silent. Rather than end the affair immediately, Hamilton continued to pay and continued to see Maria. Eventually, the situation unraveled. In 1797, political enemies, including Thomas, Jefferson's allies, uncovered the payments. They suspected Hamilton was involved in financial corruption, using government funds improperly. In reality, the payments were personal, not political. But Hamilton knew this story would explode. So, he did something almost unthinkable. He told the truth. In a 95-page public document, now known as the Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton confessed to the entire affair in shocking detail. He admitted to adultery, to the blackmail payments, and to the personal disgrace it brought. But he denied any financial misconduct in his public office. It was the first major sex scandal in American political history, and it ruined him. Public reaction was brutal. Some were stunned by his honesty, others repelled by the behavior itself. His enemies used it as proof that Hamilton was immoral and unfit for public life. Even his allies were shaken. His once sterling reputation took a permanent hit. At home, things were even worse. His wife, Eliza, was devastated. The woman who had supported him through war, scandal, and politics now had to endure public humiliation. Hamilton never wrecked. Duels had claimed lives before, but this felt different. Here was a man who had helped win independence, built the U.S. economy, defended the Constitution, and shaped the very foundations of government, now gone by the hand of a sitting vice president. Public outrage flared. Hamilton's funeral drew thousands. Businesses closed. Church bells rang. Soldiers marched alongside civilians in mourning. At Trinity Churchyard, his coffin was lowered into the ground beneath a simple stone. He was buried not as a politician, but as a patriot. His wife, Eliza, stood by his side until the very end. In the days after his death, Eliza faced a mountain of debts and 7 surviving children to raise. Yet, she refused to break. Fueled by grief and love, she dedicated her a life to preserving her husband's legacy and to finishing the work he had started. She helped establish the first private orphanage in New York, honoring Hamilton's own childhood as a poor, forgotten boy. She organized his letters, defended his name, and made sure the next generation knew who he was, not just as a founder, but as a father and a visionary. As for Aaron Burr, the man who fired the shot, he was never charged with murder, but his political career ended the moment Hamilton's heart stopped. He finished his term as vice president in disgrace, living the rest of his life as a man haunted by what he had done. Hamilton's death marked the end of one chapter in American politics and the beginning of another. The country moved forward, but Hamilton's ideas, central banking, public credit, strong federal authority, would endure. Decades later, leaders like Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt would cite Hamilton as a guidepost. And though his name faded for much of the 19th century, it would never disappear completely, because Hamilton was more than a founding father. He was a builder, a believer, and a man whose last breath became the spark of something far greater than himself. In the wake of Alexander Hamilton's death, his wife Eliza stood at the crossroads of heartbreak and duty. She had lost her husband to pride in politics. Left behind were 7 children, a mountain of debt, and a legacy under siege. Many in society whispered about Hamilton's scandal, his duel, his arrogance. His enemies were eager to write him off, but Eliza refused to let history forget him. Born into the prominent Schuyler family, Eliza had always been strong, but now she had to be unbreakable. She sold their home, managed their remaining assets, and began the long, lonely work of protecting the reputation of a man who could no longer speak for himself. She gathered his writings, letters, essays, government reports. She tracked down his correspondences, organized his papers, and defended his role in the Federalist Papers, founding of the country. She corrected public misperceptions, shared stories with historians, and kept his name alive through deliberate, careful storytelling. But Eliza's mission didn't stop at memory. She also built. In 1806, just 2 years after Hamilton's death, Eliza helped establish the Orphan Asylum Society in New York City, what would eventually become the Graham Wyndham, one of the city's first orphanages. It was more than charity. It was personal. She never forgot that her husband had been an orphan himself, abandoned, impoverished, and overlooked. Through this work, she ensured that other children wouldn't be forgotten the way he had been. For the next 5 decades, Eliza lived not as a recluse, but as a quiet force behind American memory. She outlived her husband by 50 years, long enough to see some of his ideas finally recognized for their genius. When people asked her how she survived such tragedy, she would speak softly but firmly. "I had his children," she'd say. "I had his legacy." She died in 1854 at the age of 97, nearly a century of life, half of it spent in devotion to a man no longer living, but whose influence refused to die. Eliza didn't just preserve Hamilton's story, she rescued it. Because even though the world had tried to bury him in scandal and silence, she gave him a second life, not in politics, but in memory. And because of her, the name Alexander Hamilton would not vanish from history. Alexander Hamilton may have died young, but his ideas were just getting started. In the early years after his death, his legacy remained tangled in controversy. To many, he was remembered as the brilliant mind who couldn't escape his own ego. A man who built a financial empire only to fall to scandal and violence. His critics still painted him as an elitist, a monarchist in disguise, someone too eager to concentrate power in government hands. But history, as it often does, began to shift. America grew, the economy expanded, industry rose, and slowly leaders began to revisit Hamilton's vision, not with suspicion, but with respect. His blueprint for a strong central government became a model during national crisis. His belief in federal credit became the cornerstone of American financial power, and his dream of a diverse industrial economy came to life in the factories, railroads, and trade routes that shaped the 19th century. By the time the Civil War approached, Abraham Lincoln was reading Hamilton's writings closely. He saw Hamilton as a guide, a man who understood that preserving the Union required both principle and structure. Lincoln's financial strategies during the war reflected Hamilton's belief in a unified economic system supported by national credit. Even later, presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt would quote Hamilton in speeches, drawing on his ideas about executive strength, national infrastructure, and economic planning. Historians, too, began to change their tone. The once dismissed Federalist became, in hindsight, one of the most forward-thinking of all the Founding Fathers. He had seen a version of America that took over a century to fully arrive, and in many ways was still arriving. Hamilton's critics had often accused him of dreaming too big. But maybe that was the point. His vision was never meant for his time alone. It was meant to grow into the future, to outlive him, outlast him, and evolve as the country did. He died before he could see it, but his fingerprints were on everything. The banks, the courts, the Constitution, the very concept of a nation bound not by blood or region, but by ideas. Alexander Hamilton was no longer just a man. He was a philosophy in motion. As the 19th century rolled on, Alexander Hamilton's name began to fade. Other founding fathers rose to mythic status. George Washington, the noble general, Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher, President Benjamin Franklin, the beloved genius. Their stories were retold in classrooms, statues, and textbooks. But Hamilton, he became a footnote. Part of the reason was political. His Federalist party had long since vanished, absorbed or overtaken by new political movements. His enemies, Jeffersonians, Jonians, and others, controlled much of the public narrative in the decades following his death, and they weren't exactly eager to praise a man they saw as a threat to democracy. They called him arrogant, power, hungry, a man who cared more for bankers and industry than for the common man. And then there was the duel. In a young, idealistic republic, Hamilton's end, killed in a personal dispute by another politician, felt messy, almost shameful. It didn't fit the heroic narrative many Americans wanted to teach their children. So, over time, his memory softened. The Federalist Papers, once a cornerstone of constitutional debate, were still read, but often without much attention to the man behind most of them. His economic policies lived on in practice, but not in name. He became quietly the founder. People forgot, but not everyone forgot. Legal scholars, economists, and historians kept digging into his work. Some praised his brilliance, his foresight, his ability to predict the needs of a nation still in its infancy. Others admired the raw determination of a man who rose from nothing, an illegitimate orphan from the Caribbean, into one of the most influential figures in American history. Even still, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Hamilton remained a second-tier figure, respected but not revered. His portrait was placed on the 10 bill, but few people gave it more than a passing glance. He had a statue or two, a few schools named in his honor, and a tomb in Trinity Church, but he wasn't celebrated the way Washington or Lincoln were. It seemed history had quietly tucked him away, but Hamilton had always been underestimated, and like he had done so many times before, he was quietly waiting for a chance to rise again. This time not through politics, but through something no one saw coming. For nearly 2 centuries, Alexander Hamilton's story remained largely in the background of American memory. Until one man picked up a book at an airport, and everything changed. In 2004, historian Ron Chernow published a groundbreaking biography titled Alexander Hamilton. It was rich, detailed, and deeply humanizing. Instead of focusing only on policy or scandal, it painted a full picture of a complex man, flawed, brilliant, ambitious, relentless, a man who had risen from nothing to shape a nation. The book was praised by scholars, but it reached someone entirely unexpected, a young playwright and musician named Lin-Manuel Miranda. On vacation in Mexico, Miranda brought Chernow's biography along as light reading. By the second chapter, he was stunned. "This is the most hip-hop story I've ever read," he said. A poor kid from the Caribbean who used words to rise to the top. It didn't just resonate, it sounded like music. And so Hamilton's second act began, not in Congress, but on Broadway. In 2015, Miranda's musical Hamilton premiered at the Public Theater in New York City. A bold, genre-defining mix of hip-hop, R&B, and traditional show tunes. It reimagined the founding, not because he was perfect, but because he refused to be forgotten. Alexander Hamilton's life was short, 47 years. But in those years, he lived more than most ever do. He rose from poverty, carved out a place in history, with nothing but his mind and will, and left behind a legacy that helped shape an entire nation. He was never a president. He never led a state, but his fingerprints are on the Constitution, the financial system, the courts, the very idea of what it means to be a united nation. And yet, what makes Hamilton truly unforgettable isn't just what he built, it's how he built it. He failed publicly. He loved deeply. He fought passionately. He made enemies, mended friendships, and left a trail of letters that pulse with energy, urgency, and brilliance. He was a flawed man, jealous, stubborn, impulsive. But he was also endlessly driven. He believed in building something bigger than himself, even when it cost him everything. And maybe that's why all these years later, we're still drawn to his story. Because we recognize it, the struggle to rise, the need to prove yourself, the tension between ambition and morality, the hope that your work, your words, might outlast you. His life reminds us that greatness isn't about perfection, it's about effort, about vision, about refusing to settle for the world as it is, and daring to imagine the world as it could be. Hamilton imagined a future where America was strong, structured, and stable. And while he never got to see that future fully realized, he laid the foundation with fierce determination. He may not have thrown away his shot on that dueling ground, but through his work, his words, and his unwavering spirit, he gave the rest of us a shot at freedom, at structure, at possibility. And in the end, what more could you ask from a founding father? He was not made of marble or myth. He was made of ink, steel, and fire. So the next time you hold a 10 bill, remember the man who didn't come from money, didn't come from privilege, but gave everything he had to build a country that could outlive him. That's Alexander Hamilton. And now you know his story.